Welcome back to another episode of Vlogs of History. I'm your host, Darius Cousin, and this week we're taking a look at a very interesting period in human history. The development of the arts, the arrival of printing technology, and the renewed interest in classical philosophies. You've guessed it, we're taking a look at the Renaissance. So let's get to it. The Renaissance first began in Italy towards the end of the 14th century. This was right after the end of the medieval period, and keep in mind that the medieval period came right after the fall of the Roman Empire and was a period where nothing really happened for humanity. It was a period of very big stagnation. In the 1000 years that the medieval period lasted, while technology didn't really advance much, people were killing each other left and right, and there were so many plagues that almost wiped out the entire European population. This really obstructed any kind of opportunity for progress or improvements. Generally considered the dark ages of Europe, well, after 1000 years it was time for a change. Then comes the Renaissance. Now, Renaissance in French means rebirth. The Renaissance was a period of rebirth of old philosophies that were forgotten since the Roman Empire. People started taking an interest in the ancient teachings of the Greeks and the Romans. The focus shifted to Humanism, which is a philosophy that focuses on the individual and one's accomplishments in society. This renowned interest in philosophies came with the invention of printing. You see, during the Middle Ages, there were very few books around. Since printing was unavailable, well, books had to be handwritten and were often very expensive. This meant that only the rich, the church, and universities had access to these books. If you were an ordinary peasant, which 99% of the population was, well, you couldn't really have access to any kind of books. Plus, all of the books were written in Latin, which is an old language spoke by the Romans. In fact, it was actually forbidden to translate any books from Latin to ordinary languages such as English and French. This meant that if you didn't speak Latin, well, you just couldn't read any books. With the invention of printing, books became much more accessible to the public. All of this knowledge that was once only available to the elite now became accessible to the masses. People started taking an interest in books and the knowledge that books could give them. They revisited philosophies that were long forgotten, such as Aristotle and Plato. Now, I've mentioned that the Renaissance started in Italy. Well, why is that? Italy at the time was very well known for its arts. Many artists came from Italy. During the early Renaissance, a famous painter named Giotto made very big advancements in representing the human body realistically in painting. Art became much more realistic and people started taking a bigger interest to it. Even began to be publicly shown in churches and other places of importance. Not only that, but in the city of Rome you had all these ancient ruins left behind by the Roman Empire. In 1402, a man called Filippo Brunelleschi and a teenage boy called Donatello came to visit Rome and were fascinated with what they saw. They saw beauty and history and were left with a sense of wonder as to what could have happened there. They started measuring things, observing the ruins, and even digging to find statues and other artifacts of the Roman Empire. By the end of the 2 weeks that they spent in Rome, they probably knew a lot more about Rome than the entire population at the time. They were arguably the world's first archaeologists. It just really goes to show how little interest people put in history during the Middle Ages. Filippo later became a very famous architect and Donatello became a very famous sculptor. They both used the inspiration they got from excavating the ancient ruins of Rome. In Florence, where many say the Renaissance started, well, you had one big family running everything, the Medici family. They had total control of Florence because they were heavily involved in banking. In fact, their banks were so successful that they had many branches all over Europe. They were rich, they supported the arts, and even created the Platonic Academy, an academy where you could study the ancient teachings of the Greeks. This resulted in many advancements in the way of thinking of ordinary people. The ancient teachings of Plato and Aristotle were now being taught to a wide range of people. On the other side of the world, a man named Christopher Columbus discovered a whole new continent that had never been heard of before. Exploration increased, a lot of maps were being printed and distributed, and people began to be curious about the world and they wanted to learn more. You had this great sense of expansion and of wanting to be greater than they were previously. As I've mentioned, a big part of the Renaissance was a cultural movement called Humanism. Humanism was a philosophy that all people should strive to be well educated in the classical arts, literature, and science. It also said that it was okay for people to pursue beauty, comfort, and riches. Since the cities in Italy became very rich and were pushing people to learn more about everything, well, you had this thing called the Renaissance man. The term Renaissance man refers to a man that is well educated in many areas. The true geniuses of the Renaissance were great examples of this. Can you guess any famous ones? Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, a sculptor, a scientist, and even a writer. And Michelangelo was a superb painter, architect, and sculptor. I'm sure we all know the Mona Lisa, the very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci that now sits in the Louvre in France. And for Michelangelo, we have the very famous painting of the Sistine chapel ceiling. Of course, there are many more great artists and talents that came from that period. It really is a shame that after the fall of the Roman Empire, all of the technologies and philosophies that were cultivated during that time were lost to the Middle Ages. It's also a shame that it took 1000 years to actually wake up and realize that we should always seek to improve ourselves and society. But I guess it's like they say, better late than never. Alright, that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History. I really hope you've enjoyed it and that you've learned something new today. If you did, leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. If you've missed the previous episode, you can check it out right here. And remember, these episodes come out every single Monday. And I do have another show called Vlogs of History After Hours that comes out every single Wednesday, so be sure to check it out. As always, I'm your host, Darius Cosden. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.